And without further ado, I will turn it over to the president of the Arab American Bar Association of Ohio, Salah Al-Wadala. Please take it away. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Dominica. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Salah Al-Wadala. I'm the president of the Arab American Bar Association of Ohio. We are a statewide bar association in the state of Ohio, and we've been around for 2 years formally, although we've been meeting since 2010. The AABAR-Ohio, 3 pillars are community service, mentorship, legal, and social engagement. We are excited to be co-sponsoring this program with the CMBA, and we thank them for their support through the years, and especially want to thank Awatif Assad, who is the Vice President of Inclusion and Diversity for the CMBA, as well as a AABAR-Ohio member, for her efforts in getting this exciting program together. And I'm sure you will find this to be very informative and chock full of information. Whitewashing the Arab American experience, no need to apply as a minority. And again, we want to thank as well Malik Kawam, who has agreed to be who's also a member of the Arab American Bar Association of Ohio, and agreed to be the moderator here. And so without further ado, also want to thank our fellow affinity bars of color for their support over the years. And without further ado, I do want to turn it over to Awatif, who has some opening remarks on behalf of the CMBA and this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Salah. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association. The CMBA promotes and cultivates an equitable legal profession and community. Equity, inclusion, and diversity ideals are a matter of fundamental fairness and opportunity. These ideals enhance the public confidence and trust in the judicial system and the legal profession. While the pandemic has disrupted our lives, it has demonstrated that when we work together, we thrive. At its core, diversity, equity, and inclusion ideals are about building the future. We all need to embrace the idea that we have an additional role to play in guiding our future leaders. When we work together, there is no question we can accomplish our goals of advancing equity and building a stronger community. The CMBA brings nationally recognized programs and solutions such as REAL, Racial Equity in the Law Initiative. You don't have to be a CMBA member or lawyer to participate. So please join us to effect meaningful and real change. I will put the link about these programs in the chat later. The CMBA is also a convener of all matters justice and equity. This year, the CMBA established the Council on Conscious Inclusion. We are very proud that the Arab American Bar Association is a member of the CCI, as well as our other affinity bar associations and bar leaders. The CCI brings programs like today's that delve into the issues facing our community. The CMBA is excited to collaborate with the Arab American Bar Association on this important discussion during National Arab American Heritage Month. We celebrate and honor the contributions and resiliency of Arab Americans. President Biden recently acknowledged that the Arab American community is deeply woven into the diverse tapestry of America, recognizing April as National Arab American Heritage Month. My grandfathers came to this country in the early 1900s, but Arab Americans are viewed as only recently arrived. For over a century, Arab Americans have been making valuable contributions to virtually every aspect of American society in medicine, law, business, education, technology, government, military service, and culture. Arab Americans are successful lawyers, judges, doctors, engineers, entrepreneurs, and yes, community leaders. The incredible contributions of incredible contributions and heritage of Arab Americans have helped us build a better nation. Across the country, businesses, organizations, state and local governments are re-examining their own structures and practices to evaluate whether they have adopted policies that truly provide equal opportunity for everyone. Arab Americans need to be part of that discussion. Finally, Ramadan, Passover, and Easter celebrations all coincide this weekend. This is a rare occurrence, but also a reminder that no matter what your beliefs, we are all in the pursuit of greater peace and understanding and building a better future for all everywhere. Happy holidays to all of you who are celebrating. And now to our program. Our moderator is Malik Kawam. He is an attorney at Mansur and Gavin, specializing in the areas of real estate, business, and municipal law. In addition to earning his law degree at Cleveland Marshall, Malik has obtained a Master's of Public Administration from Cleveland State University College of Urban Affairs. Malik is a board member of the Arab American Bar Association of Ohio and an executive officer of Arab Americans Cleveland, a young professionals network. As a lifelong Clevelander, Malik has devoted his volunteer efforts in promoting civic activism and political participation in Northeast Ohio's Arab American community. So Malik, you can take it from here, and everybody, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Awatif. I want to thank you all again for attending today's forum and thank the CMBA for their effort in co-hosting this event and supporting the Arab American Bar Association of Ohio in the endeavor to promote representation of Arab and MENA Americans. Today, we are honored to host a distinguished panel, and I'll introduce them briefly. Joining us from DC, we have Attorney Samer Khalif, the president of the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, also known as ADC. Samer has been instrumental in serving as the voice for Arab American community and in the effort towards the inclusion of the Middle Eastern North African category on the decennial census. Attending from the University of Texas at Austin, Dr. Gigi Awad joins the conversation, having also contributed to the body of research in support of a MENA category. Dr. Awad is a professor in the Department of Educational Psychology with a research focus on prejudice and discrimination, identity, and acculturation, including studies focused on MENA and African American communities. We also have Samah Assad, investigative producer at WBBM CBS Chicago. Samah is a Cleveland native and longtime homie whose investigative journalism includes uncovering inequality, racial disparity, unconstitutional policing, and issues facing the Arab and Muslim communities. Last but not least, joining us locally is attorney Majid Makhlouf, a partner at the law firm Burns, Ochsner, and Greenberger, located in Beechwood, Ohio, and specializing in real estate and land use. Majid is the former law director for Cuyahoga County, the second largest county in the state of Ohio, for those unfamiliar. And he is the first person to have ever served in that role. Majid is also the vice president of the Arab American Bar Association of Ohio and an value member in seeking Arab American representation in the legal community in Ohio. If you have any questions throughout the panel, we'll be monitoring the chat box. You can also feel free to message me directly using the chat function, and I'll try to monitor and best incorporate those questions where appropriate. If you're watching this forum through the CMBA's Facebook stream, also feel free to message your questions through that platform. We're monitoring those. With that, I'd like to get right into it. And Samer, I'd like to start with you. The Arab American story really begins with 19th and earliest 20th century naturalization jurisprudence. Obviously, today's forum surrounds the question of Arab and MENA American legal designation by American bureaucracy as white. But I think it's important to give a brief historical primer on how we got to where we are today. And then I'll save a follow-up question, for the implications flowing from that history. So Samer, why are we white?
Why are we white? Okay, it's a very good question. Before I start that, I also want to sort of talk about what are Arab Americans, who are Arabs, and give one sort of disclaimer. Because a lot of Americans make this sort of confluence or confusion. Arabs and Muslims are not the same thing. You can be an Arab, you can be a Muslim, you can be an Arab, or you can be a Christian. A majority of Arab Americans are in fact Christians, whereas less than 20% of Muslim Americans are Arab. So we cannot make that confusion. And you will see, as I go through this jurisprudence, the courts did that. And the courts have sort of talked about the difference of being Christian and being Muslim vis-a-vis of whether or not one can become an American citizen or not. So where does this problem begin? Well, it begins early on. First of all, Arab Americans have been around since the very beginning of this country. In fact, there's historical records that several Arabs fought and died in the American Revolution. So we've been here since the very beginning. In the late 1700s, in 1790, Congress passed the Naturalization Act of 1790. And what that said was that any, and these are the exact words, any alien being a free white person is eligible for citizenship. So to be a citizen, you had to be free and you had to be white. Well, of course, with the 14th Amendment, the term free was taken out because there were no such thing as slaves anymore. And everybody was eligible. But the term white remained in there. We also have then the passing of the Asian Exclusionary Acts, the Geary Acts. And what that basically said was Asians were barred from becoming US citizens. It also barred Asians from entering the country, and it allowed the government to deport Asian Americans out of the United States. So again, we talk about what is white, who is allowed to become a citizen, who is barred from becoming a citizen. And the question came to head with an individual by the name of George Chisholm. George was a police officer in California. He made an arrest of an individual, and that individual argued that the arrest was invalid because George was not eligible to become a US citizen, therefore could not become a police officer. When George applied for his US citizenship in the court, he argued that he was white and that he was entitled to become a citizen. And this is the quote that he used. He said, and the term back then was Mongolian. That's who they tried to exclude. That's who they defined as being Asian. So he said, if I am a Mongolian, then so was Jesus, because we come from the same land. So the argument that he made was if you consider Jesus white, then you consider me white, then you must consider me white. Therefore, I am eligible. And the court accepted that argument. And the court, and then from there, the argument was that, okay, well, Arab Christians are therefore white, therefore eligible to become citizens. A case came up later on called In-Re Najur. There, the judge in that case basically used a look test, a logical look test. He said, well, this guy sitting in front of me here, he looks white. Therefore, he must be white. And so we sort of then started looking at Arabs as well. Do they look white? If they look white, then they must be white. If it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it therefore must be a duck. So therefore, we're going to allow it to become a citizen. A few years later, in 1915, we have In-Re Dow. In that case came out of Georgia. In that case, the judge refuted the look test and said, no, it was Congress's intent when they said white, they meant European. Therefore, anybody who is outside of the continent of Europe is therefore not white and therefore will be excluded from becoming a citizen. That case was actually appealed to the Fourth Circuit, and the Fourth Circuit went back and they said, essentially, went back to the Census case, and they said anybody from what is defined as Greater Syria and is Christian is allowed to become a U.S. citizen. Okay, that in essence excluded most Arabs. At the time, however, 95% of the Arabs who were in the country were in fact from that area of the Middle East, Syria, Palestine, and were in fact Christians. It was not until 1944, where we have ex parte Mores, that a court finally ordered that all Arabs are in fact white, regardless of their faith, and therefore were eligible to become U.S. citizens. And that sort of started, and that was the final blow to the idea that we are Mongolian and therefore excluded from becoming citizens. And that forever sort of labeled us as being white. And I say that, and ever since then, we've been sort of trying to get out of the white category to try to get more of the protections that are afforded to minorities. Now, there have been some sort of absurd outcomes because of this. One case I point to is the case of Dr. Mustafa Hefni. Dr. Hefni arrived in the United States in the mid-70s. He was Egyptian, described himself as a Nubian Egyptian, was from southern Egypt, and from all appearances was a Black American. However, when Dr. Hefni came to the country, he was recategorized as white. Even though he was Black, he looked Black, it didn't matter, he was defined as white. Dr. Hefni refuted that and fought that, and he's still fighting it to this day. And he says, he says, I'm a proud Egyptian. You cannot negate my Africanness or my Blackness by simple designation of being white. He actually took that to court and unfortunately lost the summary judgment. And in fact, he claims that he is a professor at Wayne State University. I'm not sure if he's still there, but he says he lost several jobs because he was not white, because he was Black because of his appearance. He claims discrimination, but he also says he lost the opportunity to be promoted because of positions that were designated for minority professors, and because he was defined as being white, he was therefore not eligible. So he got all the detriments of being Black and the discrimination of being Black because of his appearance. At the same time, he was unable to get those protections of being a minority because he was identified by the law as being white. And that's sort of where we're at right now. And we have what is out there as Office of Management Budget Directive 15, which specifically defines Arab Americans as being white, regardless of what their appearance are, regardless if they're Black, regardless of anything, their faith or anything, you are white. So that's sort of where we're at right now.
Thank you, Samer. I appreciate that. So, I mean, basically what we're left with is a system that has forcibly designated an entire population as white de jure while simultaneously treating that population as non-white de facto. And before we drill down on some of the efforts that you've worked on, that Dr. Awad has worked on towards a census category for Arab and MENA Americans, I'd like to pivot to some of the very timely impacts resulting from the failure to include MENA as a separate ethnic category on the census. So Samah, I'd like to turn to you first. You investigated COVID reporting numbers in the state of Illinois. Can you talk about how during a global health crisis, Arab Americans and MENA Americans were essentially rendered invisible?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So, you know, as a journalist, I can say that I've seen that lack of category on a federal level really trickle down to the local level. So yes, I definitely want to talk about how it affects communities and people on the ground, especially when something like a global pandemic happens. There's no better example than the way ongoing inequities and these historical disparities were just exacerbated and just devastated many communities, including our community. You know, throughout the pandemic, my job was and still is, right, to report on and uncover these disparities. And we did a series of stories about many groups and the impact of COVID. And specifically because there was data on the number of Black and Latino residents, respectively, who contracted the virus or died from the virus, I was able to analyze that data and find patterns and trends. And that actually, our reporting prompted the city and the mayor of Chicago, Mayor Lori Lightfoot, to divert more resources to these communities. So, and then I knew, so that's great, right? So reporting, journalists can have this sort of impact. And so I knew also anecdotally, just, you know, being Arab, talking to my family, talking to friends, and talking to contacts in the community here in Chicago, that anecdotally, COVID was also devastating the Arab American community. It was definitely among those that were hardest hit. And so we couldn't find those patterns, though, in the same way in the data, right? We didn't have the proof in the pudding because it wasn't specifically tracked. You know, there isn't a category for us, right? So when I asked local agencies just point blank, I reached out to the medical examiner, you know, the state health department, the city, why isn't there a category for Arab Americans? They all pinned it on the fact that they follow the categories used by the federal government. So it shows, again, you know, how important having that representation federally, you know, really is. And so I, you know, talking about those implications to not have a category on the local level, I'm going to drop just a link to our first investigation in the chat here. Feel free to take a look at it. I worked on this story with my colleague, investigative reporter Dorothy Tucker. She's a legend and a great ally. Essentially, you know, we wanted to explore how we weren't counted and how no agency could tell us or the public how often Arabs contracted COVID or died from the virus. Remember, no one knew the scope, so resources were not diverted to Arab communities. And many journalists like me wanted to tell the story, but, you know, of our community, but literally could not from a data standpoint, at least. So, you know, we set out to really tell this story anyway. And what we learned is there's a deadly effect of not having this data, period. Data is not tied to dollars, it's tied to resources. So many of the community and service groups who we interviewed told us that when they tried to apply for funding early on during the pandemic, they actually couldn't get it because they didn't have the data. And they believe that that funding early on for testing, for education, that could have saved so many lives. By the time they actually got their first round of funding, the vaccine was already available. Think about that. That's over a year into the pandemic. So, you know, through our sources, and, you know, building relationships with these groups, we did track down Arab Americans in Chicago who lost loved ones to COVID here. We talked to sociologists, we talked to epidemiologists on how it's really mind-boggling that no one knows the scope of the problem in our community, despite the fact that, as many doctors told us, you know, as a population, Arabs often have underlying health issues that make them one of the most at-risk groups during the pandemic. And we were essentially ignored. The story we did really illustrates that human element and therefore being categorized as something else. In many cases, you'll see, you know, some of the people who lost loved ones, their loved ones were categorized as white or as another race or as other. And I would say, you know, Arabs know that feeling all too well of people putting us in these categories or othering us, right, in a way that we may never even describe ourselves as such or literally wouldn't even be accurate. And so as a result of our reporting, I'm going to drop another link in the chat. So the state of Illinois created a category for vaccine collection. So now if an Arab American gets their vaccine, they can actually now be counted as Arab, which is great. And so we're really happy with with that impact. I will say though, you know, to be honest and transparent, you know, it's not perfect, right? It happened late. So, but at the same time, group said that it was a really great first step of representation that really showed that the state didn't necessarily have to wait for the federal government for that specific case, right? So it was a stepping stone and really hope for future change. When talking to these groups, they really, really want, we all want, right, more representation on all forms, not just vaccine forms, from education to health to law enforcement, whatever it may be. Now, the state of Illinois asserted that it would need a new law and legislation to do that, to change all of its systems. So that's currently what the groups are working to do here in Illinois, to get that support, you know, for that, and a bill that would really require those systems to be created. So while we got some positive change, again, it also still highlights those challenges, the ongoing challenges, the ongoing impact of not having representation on a federal level. And so, you know, I recently became a member of the Arab and Middle Eastern Journalists Association that not only supports Arab journalists, but provides guidance to other outlets on how exactly to cover our community in a way that is accurate, is nuanced, is fair, and isn't stereotypical. And I can talk a little bit more about that later, but I'll pass it on to my colleague here.
I just found out about the organization that you're referencing. They're doing some really, really cool work. So if you wouldn't mind, please drop a link to that organization, that conglomerate, in the chat so folks can learn about them. And thank you for giving us that perspective. I want to turn to even more local in the state of Ohio. Majid, I'd like to turn to you to discuss some of the impacts with respect to the legal community in Ohio. I know that during my own experience in applying to jobs through law school, including through the CMBA's minority clerkship program just 3 years ago, Middle Eastern North African was not included in the program's application process. You know, they didn't explicitly, you know, bar you from applying, but it wasn't inclusive. Now that's included, and they actually actively encourage Arab and MENA Americans to apply. And I will note that there was folks from the Black community that helped that work. And so that intersectionality is extremely important. Majid, can you talk about, you know, your experience in laying the groundwork, you know, for inclusion in the Arab and Middle Eastern legal community?
Thank you, Malik, and thank you, everybody. Am I unmuted? Yeah. A couple points, just some of the history. I went to law school at Ohio State in 1998. And back then, the entering class per year is about 200 students. So in 3 years of law school, which means that there were 2 classes ahead of me and my class, and then I became a second year, that was a class below me and a class above me, and then a third year. So if you multiply 200 by 5, that's about 1,000 students. In the entire 3 years I was in law school, there were 2 students that we could identify of Arab American descent. I am one of them. So that was an eye opener for us in terms of the disparity of students in the law. And we reached out to the administration. We had a professor who was becoming a dean who was very favorable to the idea, and we pushed the question with her. And what she ended up doing when she became dean of admissions was to change the application form on the ethnicity to use the long form census. And then after doing that, the number of Arab American students at the Ohio State Law School increased significantly. So that was a major thing. If you think of just proportionally, I mean, Ohio State is a national school, but if you think even proportionally in Ohio, the percentage of Arab Americans, the idea that in 5 classes you have 2 students out of 1,000 is just tells you part of the story. Another thing in real life that I've worked with is as a lawyer in a shareholder dispute over a company that does federal contracting and a lot of cryogenic work for NASA. I had a client who happened to be of Arab American descent who was a third owner of a company. And when we're trying to work out on a resolution of the dispute where potentially he could buy out his partners or things of that nature, we ran into the issue of the company had a number of contracts and that were with the federal government that were obtained because of the minority status. They had a Hispanic majority owner of the company. And how do we buy out his interest without losing those contracts. And it became an issue of what happens to the existing contracts, what happens to future contracts. So it was really an eye-opener for me at that point that it was not even a question of just opening the doors or starting contracts. It was interfering with mergers and acquisitions, if you wish, in terms of a lot of these minority contractors, how you deal with them. And that was when I called Samer. It was toward the time of the Obama administration, and he referred me to what they were doing with the Department of Commerce back then. And we were trying to figure out every way we can do that. Thirdly, I think you mentioned the CMBA, the minority clerkship program. If you think of, objectively of an Arab American student at Cleveland State coming from West 117th or wherever our communities are and live, and is graduating from Cleveland Marshall Law School, let's say, what advantage does that student have that any other minority student does not have? But they were left out because, and I don't think there was any discrimination or ill intent. I think part of the problem is the comfort of relying on what the federal government gives you, because these are the criteria that the federal government gives me. I know that these are safe criteria, I can rely on them. And the concern was, if I make the exception for Arab Americans, what do I do next? Do I open a Pandora's box? Am I doing this properly or not? So often, sometimes it comes out of good intentions, but thankfully, the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association continued the discussion on that and now opened the door openly for, I remember sitting in interviews with Egyptian students identifying themselves as African American, and which they correctly are. I mean, I am somebody, I'll talk to this later when we talk about passing, who absolutely abhors the term Middle East. And, so when we say MENA, that I don't identify as Middle Eastern, I'm sorry. I know it's a geographic region. I'm an Arab, I'm not a Middle Eastern. But it is something that you deal with. It's not necessarily always discrimination, it's unintended consequences, but they're real consequences that we deal with. And I'm happy to answer any more questions as we dig deeper into it. But those are three concrete examples of having to dig into it. One more example, when I was the law director, we did a lot of contracting. We were building the convention center, we were building the new county administration headquarters. We were doing some major, if you add up the construction work that we were doing, it was in the neighborhood of $1 billion between the convention center, the county headquarters, the convention center hotel, the Hilton. And the issue always comes up in terms of minority contracting on those questions and what you do with them. And the county did not have a disparity study, actually. The city had a disparity study, but the county was doing the projects. So we were trying to get around those issues by having a city employment requirement for employees as a backdoor way to be able to do it. And then eventually we ended up doing a disparity study. But even in wanting to do the disparity study, the idea of Arab Americans, nobody was even thinking of. And I remember even raising the question with the consultants who are coming from Georgia, experienced doing disparity studies all over the country for all these cities. And I raised the question of Arab, who was just completely foreign to them. I mean, I think that they're used to these federal criteria, and you're always told that the safe route is because there is federal case law that says you have to have these disparity studies. There is the legal, if we start messing with what the Supreme Court told us is okay with disparity studies for these criteria, you risk jeopardizing the entire program. Therefore, we are going to stick with what the criteria that the federal government recognizes as minority. So the impact of this is very real. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you for sharing that, Majid. And there are some folks that have commented in the chat that they had a similar experience in terms of their law schools. And so when we have these conversations, it's about finding solutions. And so I think that this is important, and that highlights that. And you noted some of the complexities as it relates to the Arab versus MENA designation. I think when discussing race, it's important to recognize that race and the perception of race is basically like a series of negotiations spread over time and space in the private arena and the public arena, where Arabs and MENA individuals have been forced to come to terms with their race and identity, which includes actively encouraging their recognition, of their white status. sometimes as a necessity in America's racial hierarchy. So I want to move to you, Dr. Awad, and this may be a somewhat open-ended question, but can you tell us why this all matters? What is the importance of self-determination in the Arab MENA identity, and why should outside representatives, policymakers care? And does our community, are they even receptive to that categorization?
Sure, those are a lot of questions, so I will do my best to answer those. So I just want to say I'm a psychologist by training. And so I am concerned with sort of the individual psychological impact of identity and discrimination. And much of my work has been really focused on that, not only with the Arab MENA community, but also with other ethnically minoritized groups in the United States. So I just want to sort of give that disclaimer. I am also the current president of the American Arab, Middle Eastern, North African Psychological Association, which is the association that started in 2017 to really focus on sort of psychologists and mental health practitioners that are doing work with MENA communities and are from Arab MENA communities themselves. And so, the start of my work really came when Rita Stefan was the ancestry expert at the US Census when they first hired her. And she brought me in because I've done work on identity. And one of the things that I got to do was I got to pre-test an Arab MENA category that was going to be tested on the 2015 National Content Test of the US Census. And so I had already gotten a grant to look at Arab mental health and experiences of discrimination. And so I just sort of tacked that on and did kind of a side experimental study. And so in my particular study, I found overwhelmingly when there was an Arab or MENA category present that individuals who identified as Arab MENA would choose that over a white category. Right. So those data helped then make the case for the US Census to include that in their testing of the National Content Test in 2015. Okay. And so I've been in on kind of like in the background, kind of providing quantitative survey data of how folks identify. Now, why does it matter? Well, we know that we have so much overwhelming evidence that the experience of Arab and MENA people, however they choose to identify in terms of nomenclature, is in line with other ethnically minoritized individuals in the United States. So I've talked a lot about in my work this simultaneous hypervisibility and invisibility that is happening. So they get the hypervisibility of discrimination and bias, but the invisibility of not having protections or acknowledgement of their identity, right? And that this is the space that a lot of Arab MENA folks occupy. And so one of the things that I've done in my own studies was to investigate how experiences of discrimination are similar and different across 4 different ethnic groups. For example, one study that I'm currently in the process of writing up right now compared Latinx individuals, Asian Americans, African American, and Arab MENA Americans in terms of their experiences of identity, salience, discrimination experiences, and how that relates to mental health outcomes such as anxiety and depression. And what I found is that Arab and MENA folks who experience discrimination experience high levels of anxiety and depression similar to, and even worse than, other ethnically minoritized groups in the United States. And so as a psychologist, I have been focused on trying to get recognition from this group, not only for the remedy of disparities, right? So we're not only talking about mental health and physical health and education and workplace disparities, but also in all of the ways in which identity invalidation can lead to negative psychological outcomes and poor psychological well-being for individuals having to occupy these spaces in the United States, right? And so, so much of my work has been really trying to convince structures, institutions of the importance of having a MENA category, not just from the psychological, sociological, legal perspectives, but you know, for what does it mean when we're not acknowledging, you know, this group that is indeed having a minoritized experience. And so my colleagues and I have sort of talked about the cumulative ethnic and racial trauma that can happen from the unique experience of this hypervisibility and invisibility that happens with this particular group. And, you know, like I said, have sort of tried to make the argument to recognize this group. One of the arguments that I think isn't really talked about very often when we think about health, education, workplace disparities is this idea that when you put a group that does not have a white experience into the white racial category, and you're trying to determine disparities, say, for example, between whites and blacks or whites and Latinx folks. When you put Arabs in the white category, you are masking disparities between white folks and, say, for example, black folks. You're making the disparity not look so bad because you have a group that has a minoritized experience put in the white category, and then they're used in comparisons. So then we're masking problems with other ethnically minoritized groups. And so I always make the argument like, this is actually important for everybody. This is important for solving health and educational disparities and all of these other disparities. It's not just about recognition of this particular group. Right. And so it's important. And, you know, and I'm a scientist, I'm a psychologist, I'm a researcher, a professor. I'm always going to say, well, we can't do good research. We can't do good science. We can't do this if we're not actually acknowledging the experiences of this group. Now, that said, this group has a very complex identity. Right. So you're going to have individuals in which a minoritized identity is very salient to their experience. And then you're going to have folks that maybe they really see themselves as white or as American, and they don't think of themselves as an Arab or a MENA person. MENA designation has its own issues anyway, as was mentioned earlier, but they also may not be thinking of themselves so much that way until they are sort of faced with it and it becomes incredibly salient. And then you start to see like an identity development occur in which people say, look, I think I was discriminated against because I'm Arab. Right. And then they start to realize, and there's a psychological process that's actually in line with other ethnically minoritized groups in the United States. And so anyways, I have timed myself for you, Malik.
Well, I want to follow up on that last point that you made. I think that assimilation can be both, you know, an effect of discrimination as well as an evasion of it. And there are pressures to conform to social norms that are enforced by dominant race and culture. So I wonder if you can speak briefly to this idea of passing or covering, and then also leave open to the other panelists to give their experiences, their relative experiences with that.
Sure, absolutely. Like I mentioned, there is an identity development thing going on here, and identity is an incredibly complex issue. So when we talk about the census, they're really looking at racial and ethnic identification, which is not actually the same as identity development, right? And the census will tell you all day long, they don't care about identity in that way. They just want to count people accurately, okay? But we know that there's going to be different motivations for why individuals may identify as, a person of color, a non-white person, a minoritized ethnic minority. And it could be very well for fear of being recognized and then therefore experiencing discrimination that they will get no recourse for. There's no protections when they experience discrimination. Or it could be also simply that they're white passing, have a white experience, and are not necessarily as connected in this sort of minoritized way to that identity. And so there's really a range that can happen. But what I have found in my study is that despite identity salience, we find that when an Arab or MENA category is available, people will check that in comparison to checking white. And so it's in the 90%. So even with differences in identity, salience, that category ends up becoming still important. So that's, I will sort of hand it over to my colleagues.
I wonder if there's anyone else that wants to comment on this notion of identity and kind of the impact that it makes in the work and the extent to which they're required to kind of tone it down.
I will go ahead, Simon.
No. Go ahead. I'll make a slightly different point, but when you're done, go ahead.
Yeah, this is something that we deal with quite a bit, and I think even internally within the Arab American community, where we have that problem, because we often you heard it. Not to pick on Awatif and Samer's introductions, but you even heard it in the introductions that Awatif and Samer did here, how we do it even internally as our own community. Because we're trying to say, hey, we're American, don't discriminate against us, be good to us. We try to cite these individual achievements and we confuse them sometimes with community-wide achievements. So Samer's organization was initiated by a senator from South Dakota who happened to be Arab American, James Abarest. Who would think that South Dakota would elect an Arab American senator? Now, when he was elected,
they elected two.
Yeah, two. New Hampshire, you have John Sununu, a Palestinian Cuban American. You have you have these things, or even Bill Clinton would often tell you about Palestinians. He'll brag that he knows a lot of the Palestinians, and he says, every Palestinian I know is either a millionaire or a PhD. And you almost want to say, with all due respect, you're the president of the United States. Of course, every Palestinian you know is a millionaire or a PhD. So we often try to sort of pick on individual achievements and brag about the Arab Americans who've assimilated very well, who've made achievements, whether it's in the military, George Mitchell, and we forget sometimes about our own internal, the fact that we have a community much in need. The fact that we can name all those people tells you that we have an issue, that those are names, that those are issues that we have. Two, I think, I'll pick on the Middle East category because, I grew up in Palestine. I was on the border between, Africa and Asia. I grew up as an Arab. I grew up as an Asian. The term Middle East is a term in my mind that is the result of a political conflict. And why am I letting my identity be defined by a term that is defined by a political struggle, as opposed to my own culture, heritage, language, things that mean something to me? I'm okay with it for purposes of geographic locations, for the purposes of inclusion, to be more inclusive. But sometimes we've had members of our own community to hide even, they think that the term Middle East is more acceptable than Arabic. So you'll find organizations that would use the term Middle Eastern to identify themselves instead of Arab American. Every time I see a law group, law student trying to form a group, I say, don't name yourself Middle East Law Student Association, become the Arab American Law Student Association. So you have those conflicts sometimes even without our community, where we even use the term Middle East itself to sort of camouflage our identity because we think the term Arab is too strong and may offend somebody. And I think so it's a double-edged whammy on the outside and on the inside. Sometimes we want to brag of how well we did, and we confuse the individual with the public, and to how we're seen from the outside. Go ahead, Samer.
Yeah, I just want to bring up one point. I want to kind of get away from this argument or this discussion, but this dispute of whether or not are Arabs white, are we brown, are we? I don't think that is as important as whether or not we engage in a discussion, are we a minority community or not? Because as a community ourselves, we're not a monolith. We represent people from different national origins. We represent people of different faiths. We also, which is key, is we represent people who came at different times within our history. And because of that, we have different experiences. So for example, somebody who comes from that earlier generation, somebody that's been here for 3, 4, 5 generations, they may think of themselves more as white. They have assimilated themselves. Because of that, we find that they are more successful. They are more educated. They are wealthy. But is that what the experience of the entire community? No, because then we look at the newer immigrants that are here, the ones that are speaking with the thick accents, the ones that look different, the ones that don't necessarily identify as white. Their experiences are drastically different than those that have been here for several generations. So whether or not we look at us as white or brown, I don't think is as important as us looking at it in the context of government, in the context of what we're looking to do here, protections of whether or not we are minority. So for example, one of the things that we're trying to do as an organization is trying to get minority status under the SBA, the Small Business Administration, or under the Minority Business Designation, Minority Business Developmental Authority, because that opens up the door to some benefits that we can get as a minority status. We can get access to set aside contracts. We can get access to incubator programs. We can get access to help our businesses develop and to expand and to become successful. Right now, our businesses are facing the discrimination that most other minority businesses face, but yet we are not being afforded the protections or the advantages of those same minority businesses. And like I said, of the absurd context, I'll let you know that, for example, people from Spain, even though they are from Europe, are considered a minority and can get access to these programs, where Arabs cannot. People from the Middle East cannot, no matter how you try to designate or identify yourself. So I think that's a more fruitful discussion. Are we a minority? Should we get the protections of a minority status?
Dr. Awad, I want to follow up on that point, because I think it's important to, address the community's concerns. I think that, that we want to be designated as minority status. I think how we get there is important. And I think that was, the cause of some controversy, in dealing with this Arab versus MENA designation. Is it imperfect? Can Dr. Awad, can you speak to how MENA was ultimately arrived at, and how, despite its imperfections, it's a practical way to kind of overcome some of the issues that have been faced by MENA individuals?
Sure. I mean, it's not perfect. I mean, that's a great way to explain it, but it was thought of as necessary because when folks, the ADC and AAI went to OMB to try to fight for categories and recognition on the census in the 90s, right? The biggest conflict was the name of this group. And because of that conflict, the OMB said, you all need to figure out what's going on before you come to us asking for a category on the census. Okay. I mean, I'm, articulating this very informally, but that's essentially what ended up happening. Right. And so the census in the early 2000s was really, or early 2010s rather, was trying to figure out what nomenclature would capture both individuals who identify as Arab and maybe Middle Eastern and North African folks who do not actually identify as Arab because it is not accurate ancestrally. So these are the Chaldeans, the Coptic Egyptians, the other folks that do not identify as Arab as a group. And I also have done a study in which I sort of ask participants, do you consider yourself an Arab or Arab American? Why or why not? And when it's no, it's not necessarily anti-Arab sentiment. It's actually that ancestrally it is not accurate descriptor. So they prefer North African, or they prefer Middle East or Southwest Asia, which really presents an issue for the census because they're trying to get at parsimony and like an orthogonal designation in which folks can be a part of this regional sort of this regional category. And so MENA folks, okay, and again, it is not a perfect category, can be from several different racial groups, right? So they are diverse racially and ethnically, right? In terms of socioeconomic status. And so we know that, but just to have a count and then really deal with the racial question later, I think is really what the first step in recognition in terms of having this MENA category is. Just to have something where someone can be counted and then you can deal with sort of the racial question later, right? But I'm with Samer in terms of like, we just need a category. It's about minority status and these experiences. And then we can deal with the intellectual arguments in some cases a little later, once we even just have a count. I've been saying, you know what? I don't actually care what this group is called. Please just count this group so that we can get help to our communities.
And guys, when I say I don't like the term Middle East and North, obviously I'm all in favor when it's for inclusion. So obviously when you talk about the Coptics, when you talk about the Chaldeans, when you talk about, by all means, I think that makes a ton of sense. My issue with it is when Arabs use it as a way to camouflage being Arab. That's when I have a problem with it. To pass as white, if you wish, or pass as something else. I
agree, yeah.
We are running up against the hour. I wanted to let folks know that we will go over to answer some of the questions that are still remaining. And if you do have a hard stop at one, please feel free to drop out. Again, we appreciate you attending this forum. It's an important discussion and we're glad that you were able to join. So we'll go ahead and answer some of these questions. And to the extent that we run up, against the correct marker, I think we can extend the CLE credit. So I want to talk about moving towards that goal of the 2030 decennial census. What needs to happen from our community, and how can folks get involved towards advocating, and how do we get to the point where we can get MENA included on the next census?
I can tell you what I've been telling people.
Oops, I see Samer's laughing, so it might be a loaded question.
Yes.
Well, I'll let Dr. Awad go first. She was, go ahead. Why don't you go ahead and then I'll follow up.
Yeah, I mean, I was working with the team of folks for the 2020 decennial census. I won't even talk about my disappointment and anger at that. But what I have been saying in terms of a solution-focused perspective is that any organization that you are a part of, to simply ask them to add a category to their demographic characteristics, that this has to be more like both a grassroots effort and an organizational commitment. And right now there are efforts happening at the state level, as was mentioned earlier, to add a box at sort of institutions, because the thing about the census is this: it serves as the example of how to collect race and ethnicity data for all institutions in the United States. And these standards are set by the Office of Management and Budget, right? But I've actually had a lot of success just asking for folks to add the category and sort of making the arguments and giving them literature and resources to help them understand why, especially if it's not a major task, right? So I'll just say that.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, and here, and I think Majid talked about this earlier. A lot of the arguments when we tell people, ask government entities, departments to add the category for us, their response usually is, well, OMB won't allow us. OMB has the minimum. This is what they told us, and we can't add anymore because this was OMB recognized. Now, we've had this discussion with OMB several times. That is absolutely false, okay? The OMB Directive 15 sets up the minimum categories, not the maximum categories, okay? So if any government agency is going to collect information on an ethnicity, on a race, on whatever, they spell out that at least you must have these categories. You can add additional ones. It is up to you, okay? So if an agency tells you, well, we can't do it, it's out of our hands because OMB, no.
That's what happened in Illinois. That's what happened in Illinois. Essentially, it was really upsetting in a sense. We were happy to get the change, but it was also like, okay, so we did a story, we pressured the state to add a category, and then they did it after they got pressure. So this was a perfect example of the fact that they could have added it before, at the start of COVID, if they really had the will to do that and to track that information.
Yep. Now, a lot of them won't do it because of financial, economic considerations, because the more categories, the more money that has to be spent. So that's sort of why they won't do it. And then, of course, they don't want to take the blame, so they'll blame OMB. The root cause of this whole thing is this Directive 15. And we have been trying to get OMB to change it. Now, if you look at Directive 15, they also identify Hispanics as being white. But Hispanics are also identified later on as having their separate category. That is essentially what we're asking for. We're not asking for anything more than how you define Hispanics, Latinos, whatever you want to call. That's what we are. So you want to say we're Arab, but we're white? Okay, fine. You want to say we're Arab, but we're black or brown? Okay, fine. Just as long as we get back to the point that Darwan said, we are identified as such. That's the most important thing.
The one other thing I would say, and I think this is a call to action, I think, to others, if you think, I mean, Malik, you do land use and zoning as well. I mean, anytime you see a business investing in any community, where do you, when you look at a market study, you know, should we locate a Lowe's here or a Home Depot here? Where do you start? With the census data? That's what you build your market study on. So I think, you know, an avenue to tap is to try to also get the business community that very heavily relies on data from the census to also lobby the census, because they need it for their market analysis as well, in terms of where they invest and how they invest. That's just something to think about as well.
So as an organization, one of our big projects is we're trying to get the Minority Business Development Authority to recognize Arabs as a minority for their program, so that we have access to their program. So in our discussion with them, it was made abundantly clear by them that that there is no such study has ever been done nationwide on Arab American businesses, disparity studies, and the census does not collect any of that. So their problem is that they have nothing to hang their hat on. If they want to give us a designation, what is there out there that they have proof to do that? So they actually charged us with doing that. So we are right now going to be doing a study, a rudimentary study, but we are doing a study right now, a nationwide study on Arab American businesses, in order so that we can then take that data, just the raw data, to bring it to the MBDA to say, here you go, here's your data, now give us the designation. So that study's coming out. We're going to be looking for help from everybody to take the study. We're going to be having a website where you can go and do the study, and we can talk more about that later. We'll be going across the country to talking about that. But please, if you need information, please reach out to us at adc.org for more information regarding that. So I'll leave that as my.
Very good. And then, you know, we have a couple questions in the chat that have asked about this, you know, the difference between, you know, identity and, you know, pre 9/11 versus post 9/11 world. Samah, I know some of your investigative research, you know, has discussed uncovering, you know, outward and implicit discrimination in the Muslim and the Arab and MENA community. Can you discuss and identify whether that's still an issue that's facing these communities for those who may be unaware?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is. I think the COVID story that we did was a challenge to tell, not just because of the lack of data, which can lead us to actually find people to talk to, but the lack of trust in media and how Arabs and also Muslims have been, you know, portrayed and stereotyped historically, especially post 9/11, I think prevented some people at first to want to talk to us. I think it helped that I was Arab, right? But not for everybody. I think it was viewed as, you know, we're a news organization and maybe they've been burned before because of how they've seen Arabs and Muslims portrayed. And so media organizations have historically shaped how we're viewed as a community, how we're talked about. It's never really been us telling our stories. And while I think that's changing now, you know, there are many Arab and non-Arab journalists trying to tell our stories. Those who we did make contact with, when they did do interviews, they talked about that, that discrimination that they faced and how that connects to this issue, that double standard that Dr. Awad talked about, that, you know, we're viewed as white when it benefits society, but we don't share the same privileges of being white due to the extermination we've experienced, the lack of protections, that lack of category. So, you know, there's a deep pain and trauma in the community due to that. One, the lack of acknowledgement in the media, that lack of nuance and sensitivity. So, you know, it's important that people like me, right, work very hard in my own newsroom and across the country to educate journalists about, you know, this history of discrimination, this history of being othered. It's really just all connected.
Thank you so much, Samah. You know, as we come up against the 15-minute, 1:15 here, I want to leave an opportunity for the panelists to give closing remarks. Majid, why don't we start with you, if you don't mind?
Sure. No, I'll say thank you, everybody. This has been a very informative discussion. I think this is a worthy goal for those of us. Again, sometimes the success stories can blind us to the reality of the situation. It is something that we have to be aware of. We are a community that blends in wherever it goes. I mean, I sometimes joke, even we hear names in the media. Rashida Tlaib, very few people realize that she does not represent the Arab American parts of Michigan. Debbie Dingle does represent Dearborn. Rashida Tlaib actually represents the African American community. So that's how well we blend in our communities, how we go in. But again, I always want to get out of the individual stories and think about us as a community, as a minority. Are we a minority community, as Samar was saying, our collective story? And I think the need for this designation is very real in every category, in education, in business, in government positions. It's something that needs to happen. And I want to thank ABC for working on this. Dr. Awad, thank you. Samah, everything that you're doing in the media room, everybody needs to be involved in this to hopefully make it happen. There are high school students today who could very much benefit from this. There are middle schoolers who, if what we're doing comes to fruition, and if they benefit, the entire American community benefits from it.
Whoever would like to go next, Dr. Awad, Zamir, Samah.
Okay, I'll just jump in real quick, do a summation and another plug. To me, I think we have in our community many members that like to be designated white and that want to remain that, and that's absolutely fine. We're not saying that we are not white; we're non-white. We're, again, as I was saying, we're just saying we need that extra protection. We need that category for minority. We need the application. The MBDA provides tremendous support for businesses, support that we could have used during the COVID pandemic. A lot of our businesses did not have that extra protection or that extra support they could have and went under. We as a community are very entrepreneurial. That's what we do. We start businesses, we create jobs. And unfortunately, we took a big hit. And so we need this extra help. And hopefully we can get that with a minority business designation. Again, one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to get it. We're doing the study, so we'd like you to go and be part of the study. Again, get information at abc.org. The other thing is we are going to be holding a webinar on April 27th with the Export-Import Bank of the United States. That's a government bank that helps companies with importing and exporting goods. We are holding a seminar with them, and they're going to be talking about their benefits that they give to minority businesses. And here's the interesting thing. The Export-Import Bank has already designated Arab Americans as a minority designation. So we are actually eligible to get minority assistance through the Import-Export Bank. So we will be holding that webinar on April 27th. Again, go to adc.org for more information and to register for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samah. Samah?
Yeah, I'll chime in. I just want to reiterate, we've kind of all said this to some degree, but just galvanizing and educating community members like we are today and about why this is so important, and also speaking directly to and with Arabs and non-Arabs across industries. I love that, everyone on this panel has a different background, and we have people from multiple different industries. And I think, we talked about the discrimination element. And also, the fact that I think Arabs understandably are concerned about surveillance, which we didn't really go super in depth into, but I just wanted to mention that. And understandably, I think that some in the community may be hesitant because of what may come you know, with that representation, they may be concerned that it might be misused or used against them, right? And so I think education in the community about the importance of this category, these sorts of conversations we're having today, and putting pressure on, you know, institutions that have the power to make the change is key. And I think it all comes down to really acknowledging and understanding just the diverse and different experiences of Arab Americans. And if you're not Arab, you know, wanting to truly understand this community and be an ally, and you know, discussing them in a way that is sensitive and nuanced, I think is really important. And I'm so glad that we did that today.
I want to say I'm so excited to have been part of this panel, and I'm really excited to hear all of the things that are happening in the forward movement. I just want to say, you know, the American Medical Association reached out to me a few weeks ago about how best to put in an Arab MENA box and to make the suggestion to collect Arab MENA data for all health institutions in the United States. And I think that there is movement, and there are folks that are recognizing the need for this box. And we have precedent with the Latinx community, in which you do have folks within the Latinx community identifying as white and those identifying as non-white, but we just need to be counted, and we all have a voice, and reach out to folks and ask for the box. If you're Arab, non-Arab, we need folks to speak up when we are not in the room to add a box. So for this group to get recognized, it's really a collective effort of both individuals in the community and allies. And so, you know, it doesn't hurt to ask. So anyways.
Well said.
Thank you, everyone. And before I turn it over to Awatif for concluding remarks, again, I want to thank you all for attending. This is an important discussion, and I think we were able to bring folks from not only, you know, inside the Arab American community, but outside, you know, to the general legal community to engage in that discussion. If you're not already and you're in Ohio, please consider joining our bar association. You can find the link at AABAR-Ohio.org. Please visit, you know, some of the material that the panelists have shared in the chat, adc.org. I think that, you know, we need to continue the discussion, and there's avenues to be active, you know, through some of those platforms. So thank you again, and I'll turn it over to Awatif.
Thank you so much, Malik. You did a great job moderating. This was very informative. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and to our nationally recognized panelists for this meaningful discussion and being a force for good. We need to build on this momentum and equity for all. You will be receiving CLE information in a follow-up email from Dominica Essie. Thank you so much, Dominica, for organizing us today, and have a great day, everyone. God bless.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.